Hello, everyone. Welcome. The meeting is starting very promptly, as you can see. I think we're having a little mute moment here, so let's see if. All right, that's good. Yeah, if you're not speaking, obviously you want to mute. A very early morning to those on the East Coast, including my co-chair. Welcome.
Howdy. It's dark out here.
yeah.
Sorry
Jay,
to interrupt.
Go ahead, Jay.
Just to let you know that the Jabber server is currently not working, so the chat will not be working until the service is restored. Okay.
Okay. Thanks for letting us know.
Okay.
I'm gonna just put on. I'm gonna change my ear situation. See if I can limit the. Can people hear me? Okay.
Actually, your gain is way high out of it.
My gain's way high. I'm a loud person, so that's what you would expect. All right. We will start in just a minute. Let people all get in. Let's see if I can share the slides. My mic is super hot. Let's see here if I can control the gain a little bit. All right, I gotta go just a sec. Technical problems. I'll turn that down just a little bit. All right, can people hear me at all?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Very good. Let me share the slides. Just a sec. Oops. Snap window. There we go. Let's see here. Can people see my slides?
They're okay. You know, you want to go into slide mode or something, but they're all right.
Let's see here. Are people seeing the the pretty view or the presenter view?
Well, it looks like you're not even in slide view at all. We see the edit page.
Huh.
It's got all the previews on the left. And
is that better?
Nope. It'll be okay this way, but it's just a little small.
Okay. Yeah, let me just take it out of that mode. I think we'll just go with this for the moment. Okay.
There you go. That'll work.
Okay. So, note well. I think most people are familiar with this. This has to do with our IPR policies, our code of conduct, our working group processes, and the rest. If people have questions, please feel free to ask at this time. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer every question, but please feel free. Okay, moving on. Assuming I can. We have ourselves an agenda today. So before we go through that, just to reintroduce myself and my co-chair, you are in the RFC Editor Future program. My name is Elliot Lear. I'm the co-chair of this program. My co-chair is Brian Rosen, and he is also visible to you, hopefully. The program is looking at how we involve the function of the RFC editor. We've had a few interim meetings, and we've had one. We met also at the last virtual IETF. We are going to cover today, based on the previously published agenda, several issues. Don't know if we'll get through them all. The slides that you're looking at are online. I've touched them up ever so slightly, and I'll point out the differences as we go through. So our agenda for today is to go through the note well, which we did, to bash this agenda, which we are, to review the issues, as many as we can that are listed there, and to see how far we can get. The chairs would like to have a brief discussion about, well, what happens once we resolve issues? How do we record those results? And we think that probably the best way to go about that is to have a draft that is based on the rough consensus. We want to talk a little bit at the end about meeting timing and operating methods, and then any other business. But before we proceed, as is traditional, this is clearly your opportunity to bash. And I want to thank Rich Sauls, who's agreed to take minutes for us. May I ask for a volunteer in the group to just keep an eye on Jabber, such as when it becomes functional again, that if somebody wants to call out anything that is seen in Jabber, they can, in terms of if people need access to the microphone. And I have a volunteer. I have a volunteer from Brian. Thank you very much, Brian.
Jay.
Okay.
Word is Jabber's back.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah, well, Jabber isn't up, right? The Jabber is not up yet.
No, Jabber is
recovered.
up.
Oh,
Yeah,
it
I
just
heard
came
it's
back.
back.
Okay, great.
Okay, very
You have
good.
to reload. You need to reload if you want to be able to get the Jabber back working within your Meet Echo window, though. Okay.
Okay.
Reload the entire Meet Echo or just the Jabber
yes,
window?
reload Meet Echo if you want to be able to get that up and working, as far as I understand it.
Okay. I think from a chair's perspective, maybe I stay on, and Brian, if you want to reload, great.
Yep,
if you don't,
that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to do. I'll leave and come right back.
Okay. And will people please forgive me if they don't, if I don't respond to something in Jabber, it's because at the moment I can't see it. The chairs had somewhat agreed that I'd probably run the show because it's middle of the day my time and middle of the night Brian's time. Just by way of process, the way we had discussed moving forward at this point was that we were going to sort of tackle issue by issue, that we would raise issues on the mailing list but discuss them in meetings. We'll come back to a little bit of the methodology and see if we can evolve that just slightly towards the end of the meeting, but this is how we agreed we would operate, at least in this meeting. And then we'll try and note how far we can get in this meeting on the issues that are open. Any comments or questions before we move forward to the issues? And welcome back, Brian. Okay.
Let's work with the restart.
Okay. Then we'll start. The issue tracker is available to people. You can see the issues in GitHub. That's been posted to the mailing list, as has been a summary of each of the issues that are open. The chairs did do a little bit of documentary work on the issues just to indicate whether they were in discussion, whether they're pending discussion, or whether we think we're deferring them until later. Right? If any issue can be discussed, of course. Right? This is just our observation and perhaps a little bit of a recommendation from the chairs. There are a few things that it seemed to make sense to defer till later. But obviously the working group participants can raise any point that they wish to raise. Right? This is just a matter of trying to organize a little bit about how we're discussing today, but you're free to discuss what you want to discuss. So moving then to issue 10. So let's see here. Why didn't we in fact move to issue? There it is. Okay. So this issue, the chairs don't think we have to spend a huge amount of time on this today, and I'll explain why. But of course, the working group, and this is how we operate, is as a working group, even though we're an IAB program. There seemed to be a general feel that people thinks there needs to be a body, but we're not prepared to call consensus on this point yet. And the reason we're not is that some people have raised concerns. They said they really want to see exactly how the position is going to fill out before they pass judgment. In particular, I don't know if Ecker's on the call, but I think that was really the crux of Ecker's point, and I think one other person made that point as well. And we want to respect that position, but before I go any further, I do see that I would invite Ecker, if I misstated what your position, if you want to comment, or if other people want to comment. We think this one is probably, exactly whether or not we have a role. I think people feel like they need to see what it is in order to make that decision in the end. Does anybody feel the need to disagree with that characterization?
Ecker, did you want to talk? Go ahead.
That's rough. I think that's roughly accurate. Oh, I think it's roughly accurate characterization of my position. I'm not sure that I agree with the characterization of the overall demographics of the positions.
Okay, that's fair. The other point we want to highlight as part of this is we do think there was a very strong consensus that nobody likes the term thought leader at the moment, nor and a few people had said that it probably should be deferred in terms of what the term is, and that got linked to a bunch of other issues as well. And so I think we have to talk about what the term is, and it will come up in a little bit. But for the moment, we're going to put thought leader aside, right? And say we're not going to use that term, at least for the moment. We might come back to it later. I don't know. But we're not going to use that term for the moment to describe this person. And we know that we have a separate issue. We have issue 24 that's opened on this, and exactly how that works is tied directly to issue 12, which talks about advisor or leader. So we think all of this we want to just push along until into the next coming issues. Does anybody want to comment further on issue 10 before we do, go in that direction? Okay, seeing no comments, we're going to press on to issue 11. So issue 11 says, if there is a figurehead, is this person a paid expert in technical publishing? And we split that out. Is the person paid? And the reason we did that was that early on in the discussions, there was some question as to whether anybody should be paid for this. And does the person have technical experience, technical expertise in publishing? So we think if there is a person at all, we think that we believe we have general consensus that the person will be paid. But this is our view. This is what we perceive. But we would like to open this up for conversation if people feel like they don't agree with the view. And again, it's only if we have someone. If we don't have anybody, then who's taking this role, then this issue doesn't apply. Right. Okay. So I think we're going to leave it at that. We'll confirm that on the list based on, as it relates to other issues. And if you look at the summary that I post, yes, hello, who's that?
Eric.
Oh, Eric, yes, please go ahead, Eric. Sorry, I missed you there. Go on.
Yeah, this seems like a very odd way to proceed. I don't understand how we can, given that we have no job description and no consensus that we need this person, the idea that somehow we're going to decide that if we need a person with an unspecified job description, they ought to be paid and they ought to be actually technical publishing is really odd. Like, maybe they'd be an expert in, I don't know, taxidermy. So I understand you're trying to close issues, but really we actually have to address the main issue of what it is we're trying to think this position ought to do. rather than trying to like find peripheral issues that you think you have a consensus on, conditional on like some, on something unspecified thing.
So just to highlight where we're going, maybe the thing you're saying is, the key issue, right, that I think we're aiming to aim at is sort of issue 12, right, which is what is this, issue 12 sort of aims at exactly that. Would people prefer that we go right there and then skip issue 11 for the moment?
Issue 12
Mike.
either, I think.
Go ahead, Mike.
Oh, sorry.
Mike, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, sorry, it suddenly decided I needed to reauthorize the microphone. I entered this into the chat, but basically there are, unlike what Eric said, there are documents that describe, the role of quote unquote a figurehead or the RFC editor. If we don't go in that direction, then we have to look at each one of the roles that are already defined, responsibilities that are already defined, and either say those aren't necessary anymore or move them to the collective group or to another contract of some flavor. So don't hand wave that there's no job description. There is. It's that we're trying to figure out if we're going to get rid of the job and distribute the responsibility somewhere else.
I think Eric is saying, and I mean, obviously Eric can speak for himself, but I think he's saying, well, wait a minute, aren't we here to review what the job description is? Would that be fair, Eric?
Eric, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, it just takes a while to unmute. Yes, that is in fact what I am saying.
Okay, yeah. So, I take Eric's point, and Bernie, go ahead.
Yeah, found the unmute button now.
Yeah.
To me, it's a bit unclear. Like, paid is a wide term. Like, does it mean that it should be paid by the IETF LLC, or should it be like some sponsored position by a participating company, as many of the roles are? How is this like thought so far?
Yeah,
There's something that's LLC. It's going to be a contract with the LLC.
Yeah. So, I do think that there was a general view that people felt we needed someone. The exact job description, though, I think I want to recognize Ecker's point as well. Like, it helps to understand, what the person needs to do to determine whether or not the work needs to be done. So we've had some discussion on the list, though, about that in terms of what that person's doing. And maybe between these two issues, right, between 11 and 12, we really should be discussing that, right? If we looked at the note that Sandy sent, if we look at some of the discussion that we've seen from the RPC in terms of what they've been tracking, if we look at what Brian has proposed, I think between those three things, we get sort of towards the general direction of a job description. And if I may, right, if we go past if we go into issue 12, right, here's what Brian sent, right, which is it's slightly modified, and it's slightly modified based on a later message from Brian, right, as to whether we call this person an advisor or an editor or what we call him or her. You'll see that the chairs have tried to highlight what we think are some of the key points of contention in what that role might be, right? And so I think maybe spending the time here is worth it, and then backing up and looking at this is part of issue 12, right? and look at this and see if we can have the discussion about this text here, and hopefully maybe that will help inform your answers to both issue 11, issue 24, what we call a person, right, and in fact issue 10, what person we have, right. So maybe the thing to do is to invite commentary and discussion right here on this text here. Right. We had some discussion on the list. People have raised concerns about ability to hire if the text is if the position sounds weak. People have raised concerns about whether this person would be able to affirmatively bring things to the group and for discussion when they see problems. So I guess my question is, what do people think of this text?
Got any comments on the text? There we go. Mike.
Mike. And just to say, I might do some live editing if people have suggestions to, you know, to improve text or to make changes, maybe in brackets or something like that, as another organization might do.
Go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
All right. I'm kind of amused at the text because it's pretty similar to what I wrote in the original draft, the draft that I did, with respect to the split between the professional person and whatever body is related to that. So I don't have a lot of problems with this. I think it has more to do with sort of the split of responsibilities between person and whatever that group is. And I noticed in a later slide you're basically open versus closed group, and that I had the suspicion that's going to throw back into this space once we get to it. So.
Possibly, yeah.
Thanks. Mark?
Hang on.
Yep, we can hear you.
So reading this in isolation, because there's been a lot of water under the bridge, it seems like this is saying that the RSC, excuse me, the RSC role is a facilitator of a working group. And so we know what a working group is. We know how that works. I'm not sure what a facilitator of a working group is in terms of, do they call consensus? Do you appeal their decision? I don't know.
Good catch.
And so I think we really need to be really crisp about the nature of this role. And the other thing I would note here is that we are conflating whatever facilitating is, TBD, and expertise. So, you know, one function of this person, which some people in the community believe is very important, and others maybe don't, but putting that aside, one function of this person is to be a senior professional with deep knowledge of technical publishing, to serve as a resource, to advise us in publishing the RFC series. Fine. So conflating that with this facilitating role, especially if the facilitating role has the effect of being a chair, makes me kind of nervous. You know, we don't have experts come in that we use as resources like that, and also driving consensus and coming up with meeting agendas and having that level of ownership of the process. So that's something that, you know, to my eye, we should pick apart a little bit and at least examine that relationship.
Yes, stay on for just a moment. My mistake, I should have said this earlier. The red is the things that I think we don't have consensus on. And I think you've touched on the exact reason as to why we wouldn't have consensus on them, actually. Right. So my apologies for not stating that earlier. So you're exactly right.
Here, you know, yeah. Sure. So we're now exploring the ping time between Australia and Switzerland. So fantastic. Also, it says here, you know, I said it could be a chair role, but the way we're interpreting this text is, the RSA expected to ensure that RSAW consensus is well documented and communicated to the community, the LFC, and the rep. That almost sounds like a secretary role. So I'm even more confused about what this thing is.
Right. So exactly. So these are the points I think that we see as contentious. Let me ask you a different question, which is the text in black. If you were to sort of, add a red filter to this, right? So you didn't see the red text. Would you be otherwise comfortable with what you see?
I think there's still questions. I don't have strong feelings about it, but I think there's still questions in the community about whether we need a senior professional with deep knowledge of technical publishing. But let's say that we do. I think there's also a question of whether that needs to be a full-time position or on call or whatever. So I question that part of it. The next paragraph, operate by providing expert advice to the well, that would be the function if we had an expert of some sort, yes. And if requested the RPC, yes, that makes sense. The RCA may be consulted about proposed changes to guide or RFC format. Yeah, so that second paragraph after the role of the RFC editor is very reasonable, I think. We need, we arguably need someone to provide that kind of advice in some fashion, sure. I questioned the name RFC editor, series editor, but that's, I think, a different issue already. The RFC expected to attend all meetings. I guess there's a question there about whether it's an ongoing, they are involved in all discussions or it's just an on-call basis. Participate in online discussions, yeah, maybe. And then they're expected to be active in proposed improvements to the RFC series, developing vision and policy documents, and establishing community consensus for them. Expected to be active in proposing improvements to the RFC series, fine. If we want our expert to be proactive, that's one way to spell this. I think we should make a conscious decision as to whether they're proactive or we just consult them. Then in developing vision and policy documents, that is the strategy role. And I don't think we'd come to consensus about where the strategy role sits. I don't think that seems to be giving the RSC ownership of what I was starting to understand the RSAWG as owning. So I think that needs to be picked apart. And then establishing community consensus for them, well, that comes back to the question of whether or not this person is a chair or not.
Okay,
so yeah, that last paragraph is problematic.
Okay, so
or at least rare.
Good. First of all, thank you very much for your comments. I think you did a really good job at articulating, if you will, the issues. So thank you for that. Before I go further on my thoughts, let's go through the queue a bit. Okay.
Yeah, Martin is next. Go ahead.
Yes, Mark basically covered almost everything that I was going to point out here. I think that there's a real risk when you pay someone to do a job that's specifically focused in an area, that they end up dominating discussion in a particular group like this. And that's probably okay to a certain extent if you think of this person as being active and actively contributing to the discussion. But when you have things like establishing community consensus and being responsible for documents and the implication that perhaps maybe they're a chair or have some sort of official standing in this group, that really gets a little muddy. So I'm kind of with Mark on this one. If you strike all the red and you still have to deal with that last paragraph, I would probably say that attendance and participation would be enough if that's what you were looking for. You could almost completely strike that final paragraph, assuming all the other things that we're talking about here are settled. And I still have questions myself. Thanks.
John?
Yeah. First of all, while I like the general organization of this, and that probably matches Mike's comments, I certainly agree with Mark and with Martin that this text, as it's reading, is papering over a whole series of issues about which I don't think we have agreement. And listening to Mark and Martin in the last few moments, leads me to believe that we still have very, very fundamental conflicts about what this this whole business is about. Maybe not just this role, but the whole RFC editor function. And we've made no progress on that since back when. The thing I would add to those comments is that, as I've said on list, I'm still concerned not only whether the so-called working group is open or closed, but whether there's enough expertise there to actually make that a decision-making body. And if the expertise isn't there, then a very important part of the role of the whatever, if there's a whatever, becomes to educate that group on things which, given other things we've seen in the IETF in recent years, that group, unless carefully selected, may not be interested in being educated about. So again, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot here that we have less consensus about, even in the black areas, than this text would seem to imply. And in that respect, I'm in complete agreement with Mark. Thank you.
Ecker?
I find myself in the position of agreeing with John, Mark, and Martin. I think John did a much better job, frankly, of summarizing what I was sort of complaining about earlier than I did, which is like we have fundamental disagreements about how this thing should be structured, and to sort of be like, hey, we can just like wordsmith the text until everybody's happy, and like try to like that's just not going to work. So we actually need to like either like throw up our hands and give up, or like actually try to discuss those fundamental issues, not be like, hey, we can just like track our way into this being done. To that end, let me actually suggest a piece of taxonomy that might be useful, which is to separate out the topic of managing the tooling and the technology for the topic of managing the sort of style and I think maybe external interfacing stuff, like by which I mean like libraries and those kinds of things. I mean, we have like a very real need, like in the actually relatively short term, to make sure that like the that the tooling is like properly managed, and that is actually a lot of it's very tactical, so some of it is strategic, and yet then we also have longer term questions I think that perhaps people think of that are more about I don't want to use it editorial, but more about content, and so perhaps you could discuss separately how we think of those things ought to be fulfilled.
Okay, I'm not quite sure I fully understood the split that you were proposing. So stick around for a sec, okay?
Sure, and it may be incoherent too.
Yeah, it's with the hours, right? Let me make a couple of comments, right? First of all, the very next issue talks about what the structure of the group that governs strategy, right? So it's that we have this issue, right? In this group, we've tried to put together sort of, we've tried to put together a couple different proposals, right? I'm very grateful to the authors who did that, right? To see if we had a starting point. And people said, well, wait a minute, really, we don't want to use these drafts as a starting point. We really need to go through the core issues before we start writing drafts. So we tried to do that, right? And that's where we, landed in discussions. The ordering of the issues is always tricky because some people view something as the cart and other people view it as the horse. So I asked the group for a little bit of leeway on that, right? To say, okay, we are covering some core issues today, right? What is the role of the RFC editor? What is the role of the committee that's going to handle strategy, right? How is it constructed, right? These are probably the two key issues that I think people are fundamentally expressing concern on. So now you, Eric, have said that you'd like to split out sort of the tooling from other aspects, but I'm sure I'm butchering this. So can you go through a little bit on that?
Well, I can try. Again, I'm open to being told this is incoherent. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we have like an immediate need. We have so like, we got along for like a really long time with like, with a set of arrangements that were like semi-static, and and whatever one thinks of, and we could get along for like a while without the style guide changing. We get along for a while without like doing more work with libraries or whatever. Whether one thinks it's important or not, like we get along for a while without those. But like right now, like the toolchain actually is kind of in a mess, and we actually need someone to fix the toolchain. And so, and that's like actually a relatively urgent like tactical need. And like, we could like, I guess we could be like, hey, John, like John Levine could just like sit on this for like a long period of time. But like, it'd be nice to have like a community structure that understood that. And so what I'm saying is like, and I think that's like not only is a matter of tactical versus strategic, but it's also like a not unprincipled distinction between like the software and like, the sort of content matters. And so I'm suggesting that perhaps we could come to some agreement on how the software ought to be handled, and then at least be some form of progress. And then and the content matters especially got a different form of agreement. And I guess one more thing I would say is,
can I ask you a question?
Okay.
Sure. Because do you view this? Would you want this person, right, to be active in the tooling development, tooling specification, none of the above? How do you how would you want that to proceed?
Well, I guess you say this person, but I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure I believe that. But but like, I guess what I'm saying is we have I would like to start from needs rather than from like structure. And I'm saying is the need we have is for like a relatively fast tactical structure for like dealing with dealing with our like not optimal tooling structure. And that is it cannot be the case like all that has to like every decision about that has to like go back to the working group. There's a working group, right? And so we need some structure for dealing with that. And I'm saying like maybe we could all agree on that point and talk about how that would be managed. But maybe not.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go on. Okay. I guess the queue is empty. Absolutely. Okay. So, I think I'm sorry.
So I think I'm in the queue, but you probably can't see me because.
Oh, sorry, Wes. Yes, go on.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So I'm listening to all this, and I've been trying to follow the discussion too. And I think that this group has made really good progress in the beginning, but I'm sort of getting concerned about the level of spinning that's gone on in the last couple of months for good reason, right? We were actually finally getting to the point of, as some people put it today, these are the fundamental places that we disagree about. And I think some of what I'm hearing is a lot of discussion around sort of the trying to define the nebulous roles. And I started writing down, maybe we could talk about some concrete scenarios, right? Here's a scenario. And then right as I was typing that, Eric piped up with actively fix the toolkit, right? Was a concrete scenario. And I kind of agree with Ecker that was sort of a possibly a good way to go, where maybe if you thought of what is the role of this person in this specific situation, it will allow you to sort of come from the other direction to extrapolate upward into what the larger role might be. I'm brainstorming out loud, trying to figure out, how can we get beyond the stumbling block that we're on right now. Thanks.
Yeah, that's sort of, and indeed, Wes, that was where my question was aiming, right? Which is, okay, we have the need. How do we resolve it in a context that in this context? So I'm all for that. I'm not sure we can do it live. It may be a bit too much to ask of people, but it sounds like a good example to flesh out, if you will.
Ahead of time.
I
think you're right. It's too late to do that today.
So,
sorry, Brian.
I mean, what do people think? I mean, the tooling, there's clearly a bunch of discussion right now about the tooling, and there was a big deal about tooling a little while ago, as I recall. So, what do we want this person's role to be in handling the tooling? We agree they're a domain expert in publishing, and we agree that they're not necessarily an IETF expert, although we vary about how much IETF expertise they need. But what do you believe their role should be in working with tooling?
Yeah, and let me just add a scope question. Let's leave this to the scope of RFCs and document publishing, right? Let's not try and talk about every tooling aspect of the IETF.
Sure. Joel is on the queue.
Mm-hmm.
Just ruled out what I was going to point out. The problem with your question is it assumes an agreement on something which we don't agree on. If we assume, as I would like to, that we want to continue RFCs the way they are, then figuring out exactly how to get the tooling to work might well be something we could put on. We could just ask give Robert enough authority to figure out, for example, but and not burden the RFC editor with it. But that's because that really becomes, if we assume the agreement, a software development task. But if we don't assume that agreement, then the question is not even meaningful.
Martin.
I think Joel's hit on something that's pretty reasonable here, and in fact, I was going to suggest exactly that we can leave this to Robert for the most part, unless and until the whatever individual comes up with strategy has some tooling requirements that need negotiation. And even at that point, I would suggest that this is an LLC responsibility that could be discharged by the LLC entirely. And I think that's what my draft said. There was specifically a carve out for tooling. If the requirements are sufficiently complex that we think it needs interaction, then I don't see why this person would not be engaged in that process, perhaps, but that would not be a primary responsibility, I don't think.
Okay, so I guess what I've heard is that maybe if we were to look at tooling, right, the division of labor here might be to lay out certain requirements to hand to Robert, right? Who hands those things to Robert is still at issue, but and what the deliverables are would be a question that as to who specifies those deliverables. But there's probably a general requirement that has to be expressed from either the person or the community. Ecker.
Like maybe a couple. So I liked Wes's hypotheticals idea, and I think maybe a couple hypotheticals would be useful. You know, I think perhaps one would be, you know, given our current state where we're effective, where we have, you know, we have some structure, we have some type of tooling, XML, v3, etc. But clearly it needs some cleanup. And so one question we ask, how did that cleanup work? And I think what I heard, you know, Martin suggest was like basically let Robert sort it out and like basically like and just take whatever he likes. And then there's and Martin, feel free to correct me, obviously. And then and I'm not sure what I think about that. I'm just trying to like lay out the space. And then I think there's like imagine we wanted to do Markdown, or there was a desire to do Markdown. How would that decision get made? And what would that decision and then what would the and then you know what would be the project of design of defining what the detailed design of the structures. So I don't know, like I mean, like do people think those hypotheticals are useful?
Well, let's step through that just for a moment, okay? Right? You could imagine that we have this committee of some form, whether it's appointed or whether it's an open committee, and the committee says, you know what, we really want the input to be marked down, for instance, or output to be marked down, whatever the case may be, right? What level of specificity does the community need to decide on this? Who makes the proposal, right? Who agrees to the proposal, right? What's the back and forth that occurs, right? I think that probably fills out your example a little bit, right? And I don't know if other people want to comment on that, right? But as I saw Brian's text, right, if I relate this back to what we're looking at, what this person would do would be to try and bring to the attention to the group, right, issues that either try to bring to the attention the issues the group have, or to try and formulate, based on what people have brought to the group, to work with the group to formulate the requirements in such a way that Robert could execute, or work with Robert to put together a proposal to bring back to the community. Does that seem to take the proposal forward a little bit? Colin?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good. So I think this is kind of getting to some of the same issues that I think Mark raised earlier. And the problem with a lot of this is that the community likes to bike shed. And if we have someone with publishing expertise, and that's looking at the text on the slide, I can see we could find someone with publishing expertise quite easily. I could see we could find someone with IETF process expertise quite easily who wants to be deeply involved with the community. We seem to be sort of looking at roles which conflate those two, and I think the set of people who wish to be that closely involved in both communities is perhaps quite small pool, and I think that's where we're getting hung up, is the interactions and how much involvement the publishing expert needs with the community.
So let me see if I can tease that out a little bit, Colin. Right? If you look at the way that an accountant works, right? An accountant probably can say, to the client, right? You want your taxes done. I have a bunch of questions that I need to ask, right? And this goes into our red text a little bit, right? It may be for the accountant to help crystallize the questions, if you will, and maybe guide the discussion a little bit in terms of, by bringing color to the discussion so that people can make informed decisions. And then it's for the chairs of this group, and maybe it's the same person or not, we can discuss that, to help sort of consolidate consensus. Right? Is that really where we're aiming?
I think that this community doesn't deal well with that type of input. And I think that's where we get where we will run into difficulties.
Mm-hmm.
When we have someone who looks like they're in some sort of I'm hesitant to say leadership or authority role, because I'm not sure those are the right words, but someone coming in with expertise and saying, well, this is what I think should happen. We tend to second guess that. And those discussions tend not to reach closure very quickly. And I think that would be quite frustrating for someone who is coming from perhaps the publishing community, unless they are very used to our processes. And I think that's a very small pool of people, and we get stuck.
Do you have a solve for that?
No, I'm not sure I do. No.
Okay, I mean that's a serious risk that you're raising. Other comments? Miria.
Yeah, so actually I think, it's all the nuances, but I think this text is a little bit a step back. I thought that we had already a lot of discussion about the need for an advisor role. And I know also about the term advisor, we had a lot of discussion, but the idea that you can pay somebody to actually provide technical expertise. And then a lot of other responsibilities that you list here in this slide should potentially be taken over by other entities. So that might be one other person, it might be a working group where the chairs draw consensus or whatever. But I thought we already were on the track where you say we need to separate those things out.
I think that I think we've been going back and forth a little bit, Miria, right? We thought, I think the chairs thought we were in that same point, and then we had the interim, and then there was a lot of concern raised about that approach to the point where we had to raise another issue on this. And then Brian helped us sort that quite a bit. I
don't think we have any consensus about how the structure could be and how many people and entities or whatever. But I thought that there was at least a point about, having this paid advisor who brings in the publishing expertise somehow as a
I think that everybody agrees there is such a person. What we don't agree is what else that person does. So there are people who think that's it. They're just the usual expression is it's like a lawyer on retainer. When you need them, you ask them, they come in and they help you with whatever your immediate problem is, then they fade into the background. There are people who think that's it, and there are people who think, no, there's more to it than that, and that's where our problem is. So yes, we agree there is some kind of advisor. The question is it more than an advisor? And that's where there's not consensus.
And I'm not even sure we're that far, to be honest, Brian. Right.
I haven't heard anybody say there's no advisor on publishing issues. We disagree on whether that particular person is also an advisor on the example we're using here, tooling issues.
Rudiger, did you want the floor? Because I saw your hand go up and then for some reason it popped down.
Yes. Not sure whether I'm heard now.
Yes, you are.
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I don't hear you at the moment. Kind of, to me, the terms of a permanent strategic advisor came to my mind. And it would look to me like finding the right advisor, bringing in the expertise on the technical publishing. Finding a good match there can already be difficult. Expecting that person to be also an expert in some area that typically is a different job, like expertise in software engineering and tooling, makes it much more unlikely to find a good match. So I would think that actually thinking about in the whole picture a lead to communicate with the publishing advisor would be a good thing, and actually for getting a permanent strategy, picking a person and putting into the publishing advisor description the reference that interaction with that person is expected, I think would make sense. So I'm done.
Okay, now we can't hear you either. Or I can't hear anybody else. Let's just test that. Mike, do you want to go on?
Yeah. One of the things that I keep thinking about with this is that we're missing a point that the grunt work for this is not exciting. And having the expert there to advise us and to do most of the grunt work of writing the frameworks, the documents that we need to implement this thing seems to make a lot of sense. Otherwise, we're going to be dependent upon volunteers for something that is fairly critical, not just for this, not just for a tiny little piece of the problem, but for the operation of the whole system. I don't know how much arm twisting was necessary with respect to getting the various people who wrote the RFC documents before, and I know Russ and Olaf and a few others worked on it. It'd be interesting to actually find out how much arm twisting it took to get them to do that. So
I think Russ is on the call. Russ, do you want to jump the queue and answer that question? We'll provide a perspective. I know that there were other people involved, but I don't know that Olaf is around.
Okay, so it did not take a lot of arm twisting. There was a lot of people interested in solving the problem at the time. And we drew heavily on the IAB.
Okay. So, all right, John? Thanks, Russ, by the way.
I just want to push a little bit, not necessarily back, but push a little bit on this lawyer and accountant analogy. My attorney father used to claim that in addition to the bad ones, there were two kinds of lawyers, both good but for different purposes. One of them were people who were very good at answering the questions you asked and helpful if you knew what questions to ask. And the other of whom were good at helping you understand what questions you needed to ask. The same comment applies to accountants. There are accountants who are very good at dealing with whatever needs to be dealt with. You hand them the documents, but who will not push further, although they may ask questions about those documents, and accountants who will call you up and say, I know enough about your financial picture to know that you should be paying attention to this issue. Are you doing so?
Yes.
And those distinctions are really important when we start saying advisor is like a lawyer or accountant, because depending on what else we think we need, the difference between those two models gets to be very important. And I don't think I have an answer we should pick, because it interacts with everything else we've been talking about.
Yeah, that was something I think we discussed a little bit on list, so it's a good point to have restated. And
I didn't think it was new.
Yeah, no, it was a good point. Let me do this, right? What I propose is let me just back up a little bit for one moment to bring up one point that was in the slides that we published, right? We've gone off a little bit, right? Well, let me just highlight what we thought we had consensus on, right? Assuming that there is a person, right? We thought that the person could raise issues along the lines that you just mentioned, John, that if there's something that needs to be brought to the group's attention, the person should certainly do that. I don't think anybody would be, and not only that, but there's another implication there that there's a bit of a long-term relationship such the person knows to raise those issues, right? We also think that assuming the person exists, that regardless of whether the person exists, we think everybody agrees that there's some strategic body that's going to make these decisions, and we think those are going to get documented in RFCs, right? And we think that's the case, right? We still have to focus on this big point here. And one of the questions I raised on list, and this is the one that I thought was, what if we view this person as something of a senior member of the RPC, maybe with slightly different responsibilities, right? And I mean, is where they guide this conversation. Now, a while ago, we made the split, right? We said, okay, the RSC doesn't work in the RPC, but works closely with the RPC. But I don't know if it helps people's thinking, right? To think, okay, really what we have here is somebody who's trying to determine what the community, how to facilitate community needs, right? In terms of an interaction with the RPC, so that the RPC can deliver appropriate product, and similarly along the line, and similarly with the tooling team, right? I don't know if that helps the conversation, but coming back to what Miria said, I do think we have some some consensus here, and I think the chairs think we have some consensus, assuming that there is such a person, right? I don't know if this helps advance the conversation, but if this question here helps people think about the position, then maybe we should discuss it. If it doesn't, then let's not, right? I did raise it on the list and didn't get a lot of bites on that, to be honest, to see if we could clarify it. But I based this question largely on sort of a direction from where Martin was coming from, which is to give the RPC a little bit more of ability to tackle things day to day. Mark?
Am I here?
Yep.
I think it's an interesting formulation. It's one possible endpoint we could reach, that would be the conception of this role, but it's an endpoint, and I think we need to go through the process that convinces, or we get a rough consensus that's where that fulfills all the requirements of what the community needs out of however we spell this. So I just didn't want you to leave thinking that this is not a viable solution anymore. It's just that it's a solution, and we still haven't gone through the process of figuring out what paths lead us to what possible solutions yet.
Okay.
Personally, I think this is potentially viable, I guess, but we need a lot more discussion to figure out what, to get to some common mind about where we want this to go first.
Right. So just to apply this a little bit, right? When we're talking about the tooling example that Ecker gave, for instance, for say Markdown, right? This person would be saying, okay, the community would like input or output of Markdown, depending on how you want to look at it, right? The person would know would have worked, maybe would have worked in the RPC, or maybe is brought into the RPC as a senior person or something like that, to sort of work with this body, this governance body that we've been talking about, to try and ask pointed questions along the lines that John was raising in the context of, say, a long-term accountant, right? I'm just what I'm trying to do is apply that hypothetical that we were discussing. Mark, you want to go further with this? I don't know. Yes, there you are. Okay.
Not particularly.
Oh, okay. I saw your hand up. That's why Okay. So let me leave that as food for thought. All right, Martin, if you want to comment as well. I don't know.
It was a misfire of me hitting the button here. I'm not so sure that I'm confident in saying that the senior member of the RPC, to give the example that you took there, is the person that would fulfill all of the functions that we've been talking about here. And that to me is the challenge that I face. I think that there is a greater role for, I guess, leadership of the RPC in having some involvement in the process here, but I'm not sure that that is the totality of what we're looking for here. So it's a little difficult for me to answer this question.
Fair enough. May I ask you to maybe just to ponder it and share thoughts after, and not just you but others. If this is a useful exercise in terms of sort of splitting the responsibility between what the RPC does, what this committee that we're going to talk about next does, maybe the thing that we take away from this discussion, right, is what is that interface between the RPC and the committee that we're going to bridge, and ask people to maybe just share their thoughts on the list as we proceed. Is that a reasonable approach? Russ, go on.
So maybe it would help for me to spend 1 minute recapping how we got where we are. It was the case before all of the structure that we have now, where the RFC editor was one contract. It had lived over underneath ISOC. And we asked the question, why are we paying two vendors, the RFC editor and the Secretariat to manage websites. Shouldn't we just be paying one person to manage putting things on the web? And that led to the RFC editor being broken into 4 roles: the RFC series editor, the production center, the publisher, and the independent stream editor. So be careful questions you ask. Sometimes they lead you places you don't expect. But what we realized was the RFC series editor had nothing to do with publishing the works. It had to do with strategic things, not mechanical things. And we tried to separate that. And so I think it's a really bad idea now to slam them back together.
Okay. All right. I think we need some ideas about how we perceive this role still, and in particular, I still think we need it particularly in the context of the interface to the governance group that we're going to talk about next. Brian, you wanted to comment? I'm sorry.
I kind of want to go back to Russ and ask, do you say that even though the RPC came out and said, no, we need some help?
Yes. Okay. Because what we found, the problem we were trying to solve then was, we need to meet our SLA, so we're not going to focus on strategic questions. We've got to do this mechanical stuff. And so basically, the strategic stuff gets cycle starved if we put them together.
Okay. So I understand that point, but you're and just asking for your opinion, you don't object to fulfilling the ask of the RPC to get them some expertise, because they say they rely on that expertise from time to time. No one has argued against doing that, right? Everybody says, okay, well, we have to apply that.
I absolutely, the person needs to help with
right,
answering questions and offering advice and all of that. What I'm saying is the other strategic stuff can't be subordinate to the mechanical stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to say is, let's please continue to ponder this role. We might come back to this slide after the next one, but I'm going to press on with the idea that people should ponder this interface, right, and express what they want, and maybe using a hypothetical if it helps to express that. I think at this point we probably talked this issue out beyond the point where it's productive to continue, at least on this call, and we'll take the results to the mailing list. Unless we find that after the next issue, we actually have more to talk about. Okay? Which leads us to the next issue, which is we started talking about on the decision-making body, right? This strategic body, right? And we saw three or four proposals come in, two of which had an open body and two of which had a closed body, right? What we also were able to recognize in the discussion is that it's only, and when we say closed, we don't mean closed meetings, we mean that the decision processes are the people who vote, or the people who decide, the people who get to have a voice in the decision, either through rough consensus or through whatever voting mechanism. That's the part that we're discussing as to whether it's open or closed. And I tried to just roughly give some thoughts on maybe how people might be viewing the benefits of open or closed membership. These are Elliot's thoughts, though, and they could be entirely wrong. okay? And I'm sure people will tell me just how wrong they are, right? But just to give a view, right? It seemed to me, you know, we end up in situations where we're in sort of binary position, right? And so it probably helps to tease out what these differences are. And this is only meant as a starting point, and certainly it's not a working group position at all. It's just, here's how I saw these things, right? And I think Brian probably has a similar view, right? In terms of what we were interpreting, what we're seeing in the discussions, and why people were putting things forward in different ways. And so, for instance, in the open membership model, right? We're using our rough consensus model just the same way we always do for working groups, right? If the community wants somebody writes a draft, right? And it's discussed in a working group and then pushed forward through the process. You know, there is obviously the potential for a lack of rough consensus, and if something's really important to get done, and there's no rough consensus, then one can end up in a situation of analysis paralysis. So it's you know, one of the risks. There's also with open membership, there might be people who don't have skin in the game having an outsized voice, but that's always a risk with our community-driven model, right? This is not new to or specific to this process. What might be a little different about this process is that we may be talking about issues that don't normally come into play with the in terms of the IETF. Like we're mostly experts on networking and not publishing, and that's a little bit of a difference. And then if there's an open membership model, right, the accountability is to the community and whether or not you participated. And the only people you have to blame is the people who participated in the process, and if you didn't, then then that's it. In a closed membership, right, you can do expert selection if you want. You can do people who you can represent you can have participation from those people who are essentially the ones who have to work day to day with the RFC development process, production process, the stream managers, maybe others. The accountability is to those individuals who participating, assuming that it isn't a long chain to get there, right? It's sometimes, I think, frustrating. Some people view this as a good thing. Some people view this as a bad thing. And then the definition of community comes back into this question: like, who is this process serving, right? Is it serving the IETF community? Is it serving a broader community? How broad? And these are all topics that have been raised on the mailing list. So again, this is just my view. I think people should feel free to absolutely use your own criteria in terms of how you view this issue. Discard anything you see on this slide if you think it's not useful, and develop consensus based on any other point, right? But this is sort of how I was perceiving it. So with that, Mike?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to make a point about is how this group might differ from a normal working group as an open membership thing. We don't normally acknowledge it, but our working groups sort of function as meritocracies of some flavor. The people who are involved, the people who are talking, the people who are writing the code tend to have heavier weight given to their decisions than the other people. Given the product here is going to be the documents that describe the standards process, unless we get volunteers who are writing this stuff, and again, like I said, I don't know that that's going to happen a lot. Russ did mention you grabbed it from the IAD as opposed to going for a general working group for the previous documents. You may want to think about how you would structure the thing so that, again, we don't get to the consensus paralysis problem if we don't have that meritocracy thing happening.
Okay, thanks for that. Mark.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I agree that dynamic is going to be important to watch. I do think that this group can operate with open membership if we set it up in a way that encourages good participation. I think this in my mind, brings to mind this role of the expert advisor and how their voice would be heard in this group. And my expectation would be that that is one form of the meritocracy that Phil was referring to. Sorry, Mike. I have a medium-ish strong preference for open membership on this, but my lie down in the road kind of aspect of this is that if it does have a closed membership of some form, its decisions need to be made in public. The input to it needs to be public. It needs to be accountable. None of this, oh, well, I talked to a few people and we decided to go do this or whatever. It needs to operate as if it were a working group in the sense that we run them, where the community can go and look and say, okay, they just made this decision and they made it based upon these principles and on this input and this reasoning process, and reconstruct that. And if we can't do that, I don't know why we're here.
Yeah, just a comment. I think, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, Mark, I think Mike's draft sort of covered that ground pretty well, in terms of making these decisions out in the open. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I don't have it paged in. I could go and have a look. But if anybody disagrees with the characterization that I just gave, I'd love to hear it, and I'd love to hear why.
Yeah, me too. All right, thank you. Eric.
I think I partly agree with Mark in that I think, but I guess I think it should be open, and I don't think even the amount of daylight he's proposing is really acceptable. I want to talk about this sort of this topic of skin in the game, which I think is a little odd, in the sense that the basic assumption here is that the people who participate in the IETF working groups, the people who are writing the documents, and therefore are the people who will be engaging with the RFC publication process. So it's of course possible that people are just hanging out and not engaging in the RFC publication process, but I think we should reasonably expect them to have some skin in the game. And so the idea that closed group somehow consists of people who have more skin in the game seems unusual to me. Why would that be the case? So I guess I'd like to hear you elaborate on why you think the case that a closed group somehow has more skin in the game than an open group.
Okay, the thinking is that the people can just walk into a working group, and participate. We allow that. In fact, we encourage it. Right? It's how people get their start. They don't get their start usually by writing an internet draft, though sometimes they do, right? And maybe they participate in the development of work that's already ongoing. They may or may not. They may have walked into the room for reasons that they just wanted to see what was going on. They found, oh, this is interesting, and they comment. And they may not be publishing RFCs, right? They may not be in the editor queue. They might not even have an internet draft, right? But they might be interested maybe for other reasons, right? Unto themselves, and it's not like they would be illegitimate, right? It's just that the people who are day-to-day active in these things tend to be the stream managers who have to stream managers, and to a slightly lesser extent, but only slightly, the authors. Right, the stream managers have to work with each of the authors pretty closely in terms of publishing. That's certainly much more so the case. The ISE is a specific individual, right, who does this. The area directors in their capacities as representing the IETF stream when a document comes forward for discussion, right? They have to interact directly. That's all I meant. And again, you can choose that logic or not. By the way, you could say, well, actually, I don't agree, Elliot. Anybody should be able to participate, and everybody has skin in the game. It's the readers that have skin in the game, and you can fill in that value for yourself. Right? It was just my own perception, and entirely reasonable to, maybe even more reasonable than I have on the slide to disagree with you. Martin?
Oh well, I guess I did want to respond to that quickly.
Sorry. Okay.
I think I do disagree with that. I think it's actually like this is a situation in which like these people will probably have more skin in the game than almost any other situation. Like in IETF, where we routinely make technical decisions based on people who like may never implement the protocol and just have opinions, right? But like more or less by definition, the people who are like who are in these meetings, like are engaging the IETF standards process, are probably consumers of and potentially future authors of RFCs. So I think it's I think they have more skin in the game than almost any other condition where we make IETF decisions.
Fair enough. Entirely reasonable view. Martin.
Yeah, so I was about to make a similar point. When you look at both of these options here, you are essentially still staffing them with volunteers, and whether they are appointed for a term or just turn up on their own recognizance. So I actually think that the open membership program stands a better chance of taking the sorts of input that we're likely to see from document authors and the like, whereas the closed membership thing has this barrier to engagement whereby, okay, so the meetings are in public, but they're at a scheduled time that's inconvenient for me. I don't feel like I can send an email and then engage in the conversation on an ongoing basis, because that's just not how these bodies operate necessarily. I'd have to reread Mike's draft in order to see whether he had addressed that or had ideas along those lines. But I ultimately think that the open membership is more likely to attract the sorts of input that we're looking for here. And I share Mark's concerns about making sure that this process is open and well documented and whatnot.
Okay, before we go further, let me just ask, are there people who would actively object to the open membership model? And if you could, John and Phil, can you unless you are going to actively object, could you let those who are skip the queue, and then we'll come back to you.
You actively object.
You actively object. Could you say more?
I had intended to.
Okay, please.
Since I'm first in the queue, let me come back to that working group meritocracy analogy and make another one. In the case of a working group, the people who become active in a working group, and that is active as distinct from half asleep in the back of the room doing email, tend to be people with specific interest in the subject matter and specific expertise in subject matter. And within a working group, and I think this is part of what Mike was talking about when he's talking about expertise, the people who don't have a clue rapidly get filtered out. People stop paying any attention to them. And in years past, we've been brutal about that, and we've, I hope, gotten a lot less brutal, but the effect is the same. And sometimes that doesn't even work very well, because the boundary between not expert and having expert and competent views, which the people driving the working group don't agree with, sometimes get very confused with each other. But let's draw another analogy to something which is open. Is discussions on the IETF list. And discussions in the IETF list have often, especially in recent years, turned into situations where people are expressing very strong opinions about subjects they know almost nothing about. And then we go into rat hole tours with very long threads, which never really go anywhere. And my concern about an open group gets back to the question of having sufficient expertise, and to paraphrase a comment which was made in the chat, a situation in which the expertise loses because the people with very strong opinions and the people who may be there because they have agendas which are different from whatever the agenda is of the expert, and indeed whatever the agenda is that we come up with, dominate the discussions because they have the time and energy and passion, as distinct from because they know what they're talking about. And again, we've seen that on the IETF list. So I'm not opposed. I certainly want the kind of openness that Mark was talking about. And I'm not opposed to any of that. But I think if we go for completely open and dependent on whoever shows up, we end up with the IETF list problem. And indeed, to a certain degree, some of the problems which have plagued this group, which is to say that some of these, we usually talk about elephants in the room, but it may be more like alligators in the room, yet issues get suppressed because we're busy trying to come to conclusions, and that's coming to conclusions worthwhile ideas. But when our conclusions are hiding those fundamental issues and those fundamental disagreements about what things are about and what things are important, there's a tendency to get bogged down and drift, and for the expertise to get lost in the process. And I fear in this particular kind of environment we're talking about, for the experts to get frustrated and quit.
Thank you, John. Phil? Phil, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, on the open versus closed piece, the problem is, though, that this is an area where if you close the working group, how can you be sure that you're shutting the expert in rather than out? This is an area where there are a lot of people who imagine that they are very expert and are very fond of telling people who have, say, spent a considerable amount of time and effort putting together a global hypertext document system and being part of intense discussions on this topic for several decades with very, very well-known people in that field, and get told, well, you know absolutely nothing about it. I'm feeling a bit adrift with this conversation because I can't quite see how many levels of meta we are at the moment. We seem to be discussing process, forming a process to discuss something. One big difference in this work and regular IETF work is that the premise of most IETF working groups is that we finish. In that, PKIC, we did the work and we closed the working group. At SMPC, you do the work, the IETF isn't like a lot of standard bodies in that you don't have a regular review cycle. There are places where, either you have to, every 7 years, every 5 years, you go back and look and see if you need to reflect. I think that for this work, you need to consider that as part of the framework to start with. And here's why. With the XML to XML RFC work, a lot of the decisions that a lot of folks might have might have wanted to duke it out and die on that hill 5 years ago, let things slide, saying, okay, getting the right character from that's not really important to me right now. I just need to get HTML output done. And then by the time that things kind of like opened up and there was something there that you could comment on, that you start to go, oh, we already made that decision 5 years ago, you're too late. And I think that we have to start from the perspective here that this is going to be an ongoing process that doesn't have a preset end, that there's going to be refinement, and that people have to know that, okay, we can let it slide now because there'll be another opportunity in 2 years or 3 years' time to bring this up if we didn't get a hearing last time. But something that really does gum up the works is if people are told, well, it's too early to raise that now, then when they try and raise it later, they say, well, you're too late. And that
Okay,
absolutely has been happening.
Okay, so I think I want to just tease out a couple of things here. I heard your point that which I thought was a good one, which was that if you have a closed membership, how do you know that you're not shutting the experts out, and how do you even identify expertise? I think was one of the key points you made. The other point that you were making was timing of raising issues or otherwise processing changes. Let's take those separately and just focus on the first for the moment, but feel free to open up an issue separately on the modalities of the group that gets formed, because I think that's something that you're capturing. Joel.
Unfortunately, I don't think these, as we've noted multiple times, I don't think these questions separate well. I'm very sympathetic to the issue that we want good ways to get real community input, something better than the current RFC interest email list. If I have a strong RSA model, if this group adopts a strong RSA model, then having an open group that works with that strong RSA strikes me as eminently effective. However, if I'm stuck with a weak RSA model, then it better be a carefully selected and small group that works with that RSA, because the combination of a weak RSA and an open quasi-working group that's supposed to make this whole thing magically work causes my head to explode.
So just to elaborate there a little bit, Joel, stick around for a moment. When you say a strong RSA versus a weak RSA, let's just be a little bit more specific. What do you mean by that?
I'm not hung up on a very precise meaning, but for example, an RSA who is acting as the chair of this working group and empowered when needed to make things happen, but is expected to be paying attention to the working group and going along and working with the rough consensus of the community. Something like that is a strong RSA. A weak RSA is an advisor who's asked questions and gives opinions when asked.
Okay, thank you.
And there's room to fudge in there. I'm not saying that those are the only two possibilities in the world.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you very much. You might want to elaborate that a bit more on list as we go forward. Rudiger.
Looking at the alternatives of open versus closed membership, what I'm seeing is looking at how we are running stuff in the IETF. There are actually things that kind of allow a hybrid operation. I would guess that there are good reasons for running an open membership working group kind of thing, but alongside of working groups in regular IETF organization, we sometimes have directorates, which are kind of closed groups of well-defined groups of named persons, and for say the interfacing to an RSA of some kind, probably such a fixed group would be much better than the not so clearly defined open membership group that certainly is somewhat better for representing and bringing the input from the community side in an open fashion. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Brian.
Hello. So a couple of things. Actually, I kind of agree with Rudiger in the generalities, but probably disagree in the specifics. Richard Barnes just typed into the chat something that I'd like to reflect here. Does it need to be said that closed membership does not imply either expert or skin in the game? I think it does imply sort of like accountability can be had. I think it does imply that there's like someone who is designated to be part of this sort of decision-making process, the strategic process. And I think that there are wins to having that, even if there's not like sort of the direct implication that it's always going to be, you know, an expert with skin in the game. I'm a little tempted to say that like this open membership versus closed membership thing is a little bit of a false dichotomy. I think we can have a process or something that gets you the best of both worlds here. So that's where I agree with Rudiger in the generalities. One thing that the IED has done recently, and I applaud them for, is be more open. So the IED open meeting where we get information about the programs. Some of the programs have built out, they're still membership oriented, but open meetings, but they've built out sort of memberships that are much more inclusive than sort of some of the, you know, handpicked experts groups and programs in the past. I'm wondering if a hybrid model like that along the lines of an IED program could work, where you essentially have a set of appointed people to this body who are required to have open meetings that would have sort of like an open mic portion of the open meeting, are required to consider that input, and also have them sort of like a open discussion on the mailing list. So it's not closed in terms of we have a closed door where you can talk about things that will remain confidential because there's no disagreement at all that we don't want that. But it's closed in terms of there are people who are designated by the community to be responsible for being this strategic body. I would encourage us to look at that sort of like a hybrid model like that.
So, Brian, are you familiar with Mike St. John's draft?
I am not. I kind of parachuted into this meeting today.
Okay,
I didn't pay attention to the early part of this process because I was taking a break from the IED for the last year.
Well, congratulations on that. Welcome back.
Thank you. Go read Mike's draft.
A little bit of that, right? But I think so. I think the contention here isn't so much on being able to provide input. I think what I heard from Mike's draft and from Neville's draft as well was that there should be an open input process. That the process should be transparent, but that there are decision makers that are appointed. Either through either ex officio or selected through nom-com or something along those lines. And then there's a different view, right, where it's more the working group model.
Right.
But I think from the chair's perspective, sitting as a chair, I think there's strong consensus, very strong consensus, that the model be, whatever we decide, be entirely transparent, right? And that people have the opportunity to provide input, that nobody is surprised by decisions. And if anybody believes that's incorrect, let it speak loudly.
Okay, cool.
And as Mark put it earlier, and explain why. Right?
Yeah. So
yeah.
Okay. So given that, I think I would, you know, my opinion would lean toward a closed membership model, a closed membership open process model. Simply because I think not for the expert selection reason, not for the skin in the game reason, but I think that this is an important enough function to the community that we want people who are essentially held accountable for driving the strategy forward.
Then I have a request of you, and not just to read the draft, of course, but always, and to everybody else, right? But if you have a selection model in mind, and it doesn't match that of Mike,
yeah,
that you put something forward.
Yep, I can do that, definitely. I don't actually have a model in mind, but I will think about it.
Okay, we're coming close to the time where we want to move on to some of the other points that we have on the agenda. So let's see here, Brian. I think this is the part where we close the microphone, right? For this issue, just to check with my co-chair.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'm not sure that we can do any of this because there's no consensus to write any text.
Yeah, not yet, but let's get there in a moment. Wes?
Are you closing the queue or are you okay?
Wes and Mark.
No, we're going to finish. We need to finish the queue.
Yeah, closing the list line.
Closing the queue, but we will let people in the queue speak. Wes?
I think that the important question that has come up for me in the past discussion is, how does the community interact with the group, regardless of whether it's open or closed, regardless of whether it's open for observance or open for participation? How does the community give feedback? And so, an example would be, should this strategic body have an open mic line at the plenary? Should the strategic body be, have an open mic line that's part of another open mic line that already exists, like, the IEB, previously that Heather sat on? So I think community feedback is an important consideration, that the results of any strategic body ends up greatly affecting the participants of the entire IETF, and there has to be a feedback mechanism there. What does that feedback mechanism look like?
Okay. Thank you. Mark.
Thank you, Wes. That was actually really good, and it leads right into, or it's complementary to what I was thinking, which is, I think the characterization that's bugging me here is the word closed. In that, looking at listening to the discussion, looking at what's happening in Jabber, I can see a model where the decision making is modified from how a working group works. That, it's some combination of our purported expert and the stream leads and maybe some other folks, but you have a nominated set of people who are either make the decisions or have unusual weight in making decisions, and that's very hand-wavy, I know. But what I don't want to see is an expectation that they will talk amongst themselves and the community will just merely watch, or be allowed to dial into a call once in a while. That, to me, is not an open participation model. I would expect, as a member of the community, if I'm not one of those people, to be able to get something onto a meeting agenda, provided that enough people think that it's reasonable to talk about. I would expect to have an open discussion, much like we're having here. It's just that the final decision might not be made in a way that we typically make in a working group. And if we can come up with a model like that, I think I could support it, but I don't think we should call it closed membership. I think, well, first of all, membership is a weird concept in the IETF anyway. So I think it's worth exploring in that direction. But like I said, I do really want to be able to bring something to the group's attention. And if it's thumbs down, don't do it because of reason X, Y, and Z, fine. But none of this, oh, you can listen to our calls, but please don't talk. That's what's
Okay, we did close the list, but if you're really quick, Mike, and it's just like to respond, please just be brief.
Open. We have closed groups. The IAB and the IESG are selected for a particular set of responsibilities. This is no different.
Okay, so thank you. All right, we didn't actually, neither of the chairs actually expected to close this issue today. But I do think we've had a pretty productive dialogue. A couple of comments just to wrap up. People don't like the word open or closed. We caught that. It's the selection for who gets to decide as part of decision. That's number one. Whether it's the people who show up in a working group or whether it's people who are selected based on some criteria. That was one issue. I think the second issue that we heard loud and clear, and I want to confirm this on the list, but any model that's put forth, even if it's a model in which people are selected, specific people are selected, that there has to be an ability for the community to interact with those people openly, that there be transparency, and that decision processes be documented, etc. And I don't think anybody has argued differently along those lines. The one exception that I did put on the slide was that there was the possibility that personnel discussions could hit, in Mike's case, I think you said this, the RSEB. That's something further to discuss on the list as to what the limits of openness would be in these contexts in terms of any sort of personnel selection, and whether there is personnel selection discussions in these things. And I think that has to be further discussed. There are some issues open on that, and I'd encourage you to take a look at those. So moving forward then, what we'd like to do is continue the discussion about what people would find acceptable. And my suggestion is this. If you have a preference for one or the other, why don't you state it on list, but also go to the other, go the other way and say, do what Joel did, which I thought was great, and I think Mark, you did the same thing, which is if it goes away that maybe I might not prefer, right? What would be the parameters under which I could find it the other acceptable? And if people can get those out onto the list, I think that will help move the discussion forward. And so with that, the chairs had two other issues on the agenda. The first is probably going to be a very short discussion indeed, but I keep saying that and I keep being wrong, so we'll see. So we think probably it helps that as we begin, and I do think we are going to be able to start to close some of these issues soon. I think we are going to, call me an internal optimist, but I believe like that last issue, we are going to be able to start to find some common ground soon. And so once we do find that common ground, we need a way to document it. And of course, the way we document common ground at the IETF is through a draft. And so we think we need a skeleton to start to capture this so that we have text that we can bite into and maybe debate a little bit more as we come closer to consensus. It should the text should mostly capture the consensus that we have. And if it's not perfectly captured, then we debate it and get towards consensus. And we think we'll need an editor to do all of this. We haven't discussed who that editor would be yet, but we'd like to proceed along the lines that we'll pick up a person to do this. Of course, it'll be a person who's involved in this group, I'm sure. And so all I want to ask on this question, does anybody have any objections that the draft would not take positions that have not had consensus declared? Are there any concerns with that approach? Mike, do you have your hand up at this point for this particular topic, or is it just up for some other reason? Okay. Ecker, did you want to get a word in?
I guess I have half a concern. What you mean? I think this is a fine approach in general, but I think that like as a sort of to just reiterate my comment earlier that like I think we're going to need to get substantially further along before like we're going to be able to iterate on this in this way. So, but I have no problem with this proceeding at this point once we get to the point where like we actually already start writing stuff down.
To just be clear, right, we do have a few things that we have consensus on. Right, if you look in the tracker, they're very basic stuff, right? And so take a look at the tracker. Provide your comments on list if you're comfortable with those at least being written down. And then if you see you have concerns, and for instance, Adrian raised some, I forget which issue was, but he did raise some concern about a little bit of the text that needed to be wordsmithed. And take a look at those. It's not like we have nothing here. And actually, Brian was really good at highlighting that, which I want to thank you, Brian Carpenter in particular, on that. Okay. John?
First of all, I think this is a fine approach, and I'm very much in favor of it. I just want to raise the caution again that we not manage to get text in here which papers over very fundamental disagreements, where we are agreeing that the text is correct in papering over those disagreements, but in papering over those disagreements, they tend to get lost. So just a caution.
Okay, well taken. Pete. Welcome, Pete.
Am I here? There I am.
You're most definitely here, or there at least.
I generally try to duck saying anything in this group, but I would ask the chairs to do a really good review of the Jabber Room after this session, because I think there are a bunch of people who actually agree on a lot more than is apparent from the voiced discussion that's been going on. I think there's some good stuff going on in there.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, we have this little problem, which is one of the chairs, particularly I, cannot see the Jabber because of the technical issues earlier, but your point is very well taken, and thank you for that. Okay, so we'll proceed along these lines very conservatively, okay, to John's point and to Eric's point. And we'll be in touch with you about this, but please comment on the list if you would like. All right. That brings us to our last, second to last issue, sorry. Meeting time and operating methods. And this probably goes to a little bit of what Pete just said, so we'll come back to that. So issues are gonna at least get aired in at least one meeting. And that's because I think perhaps we do a little better in terms of trying to go through these issues when we talk together. And I think people like that idea. We did say that. We said that meetings, after some discussion, we said that meetings would take place roughly every 4 weeks with varying times to accommodate time zone issues. And we said that everything would, of course, be confirmed on list. The only other thing I would say is if the opportunity arises to gain consensus in email, if nobody really has great concerns, then we don't have to wait for a meeting. Maybe we have a 3-week discussion period, but we're going to be conservative. The chairs will be conservative about that. If we don't see a reasonably good consensus, then we'll just wait till the next meeting. In terms of that, as we have been today, right? We didn't try and say, well, we have, except for on one point where I'm pretty comfortable we do have consensus. I don't think it wasn't a new point either. So on that second bullet, is anybody uncomfortable with these aspects here? If you want to comment, right? We'll still continue with our meetings as we said, and if we can knock down some stuff, prior to the meeting, that's great. And if not, we'll continue along the same ways. Mark?
Your consensus calls are crystal clear with the distinguished subject, maybe lots of all caps, so forth, because there's a lot of email.
Yeah. Okay. We'll make it. We will be very clear about it. Thank you. Okay. I'm not hearing a lot of concern about this, let's see how we go. I think we have some sticky issues. A lot of issues won't meet the model where we don't need to discuss, but maybe some will. Along the lines of the next meeting, we said about every month. Today's the 19th of November. The 19th of December is a Saturday. The following week runs us into holidays. So what we do is we propose to have the meeting at this time, which would vary the time based on the fact that we're relatively we're trying to hit the right time zone distribution. What I would say is if people have strong objections to this time, this is 2300 GMT. If they'd like to have the time at another meeting, just drop the chairs a note. If you want to copy the program list, that's fine. But we think this is the right time for the next meeting for people to participate. It's not convenient for everybody, but we'd like to set an interim for that. And if you have strong objections, please, you can say so now, or you can bring them to the list. Okay, and that brings us to any other business. Does anybody want to raise any other business before we close? All right, Brian, do you have any closing thoughts you want to add? I guess I'm taking that as a no. Brian, can you?
I had a little local problem. It's okay. No, I'm okay. We're slowly getting somewhere. Hopefully, we can get into some level of consensus, and some of these more not relatively here, given where we are now.
Okay. All right. Then I would like to thank everybody for participating. I think we had a very productive conversation. I know it seems frustrating that we're moving along slowly. There's a lot of knotty issues here. I don't want to gloss over any of it, as John pointed out. We're talking about changes to a model that's pretty core to the organization. Everybody wants to proceed carefully. I do think we have some common ground, though, and I'm in that sense I'm encouraged. But it will take a while. It's clear, and I appreciate everybody having patience and participating and engaging. And I encourage you to engage on the mailing list. The chairs will post a summary of this as usual. We'll post the minutes. I'll post the updated slides, which were just only modestly updated since the previous one. And I wish you a pleasant rest of your IETF meeting, and we'll see you in a month. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Minutes are encoding.
Thank you, Rich, for the minutes.